The morning of October 3, 1983, started the same way every morning in Champaign County, Illinois had started for the past 200 years, with the smell of cold earth and the low orange fire of a sun crawling up over the flat horizon. But this morning was different. Along the gravel shoulder of County Road 2000 East, a line of pickup trucks sat idling, doors open, boots on gravel, men standing with their arms folded across their chests and their coffee going cold because they had forgotten to drink it, all of them staring at the same thing. 300 acres of soybeans, gold as a cathedral window, heavy on the stem, row after row, perfect and unbroken, stretching all the way to the horizon, while every field on either side of it sat brown and empty, and exhausted from a summer that had tried to kill everything that grew. Nobody spoke for a long time. And then, from the far end of that golden field, an old green tractor, a 1963 John Deere 4010, mud-caked, loud enough to shake the air, came rolling toward them. And on the seat of that tractor sat a 69-year-old man named Earl Hutchkins, and he was smiling. Let me tell you about Champaign County, Illinois in the spring of 1983, because you need to feel it before you can understand what Earl Hutchkins did. Champaign County sits in the dead center of a state that sits in the dead center of a country, and it is as flat as a promise and as wide as worry. The soil there, dark, almost black, ancient glacial till deposited 12,000 years ago, is some of the most productive dirt on the face of the earth. Corn and soybeans grew from that ground the way water flows downhill, naturally, inevitably, as if the land had no other purpose. But by the spring of 1983, that land had become a trap. The American farm crisis, the worst since the Great Depression, was chewing through families the way a corn picker chews through stalks. Interest rates had climbed as high as 21% in 1981, and farmers who had borrowed heavily in the boom years of the 1970s were now drowning. Across the Corn Belt, banks were calling in loans. Auctioneers were pulling up to farmsteads that had been in the same family since Abraham Lincoln was alive. You could hear the grief at every county seat, at every grain elevator, at every diner where farmers pushed pie around on plates they weren't eating. In Champaign County alone, between 1981 and 1985, more than 400 farm families would lose their operations. 400 families, 400 histories, gone. And into this landscape of fear and foreclosure, the federal government stepped in with a program called PIK, Payment in Kind. The idea was simple, and for most farmers it felt like a lifeline. The government would pay farmers in surplus grain to leave their fields unplanted, to rest the land, to reduce supply and prop up prices. Corn acres would be cut by 30% nationally. In the coffee shops and feed stores of Champaign County that spring, there was only one question being asked: are you taking the PIK money? Almost everyone was. Almost everyone. Earl Buck Hutchkins had lived on the same 300 acres his entire life. He was born in the farmhouse that still stood at the north end of the property in 1914, the same year the Panama Canal opened, the same year the Great War began, and he had watched the world change from the seat of every tractor his family had ever owned. He was a thin man, thin in the way that men who have worked outside every day for 60 years become thin, not weak, but stripped of everything unnecessary, every ounce accounted for. His hands were remarkable things, wide and dark and ridged like a field after disking, with knuckles that had been broken and healed so many times they'd lost track of their original shape. He wore the same olive drab canvas jacket every day from September to May, and his boots were resoled so many times that the leather uppers and the rubber soles were from 2 different decades. His wife Maybelle had passed in 1979. They had 2 children, a daughter in Champaign City who was a schoolteacher, and a son named Dale who had left the farm for a job with Caterpillar in Peoria. Earl had run the 300 acres alone since Maybelle died, which is a thing that sounds simple when you say it and sounds impossible when you think about it. He had no hired help. He had no operating loan, not anymore. He had paid his land off in 1971 and had sworn, standing over his father's grave, that no bank would ever hold paper on that ground again. It was a solemn oath, and he had kept it through years when keeping it meant eating beans 3 nights a week and driving a truck with no working heater through Illinois winters. He was not a man who complained. He was not a man who explained himself, either. When people asked him what he was thinking, he had a habit of looking off at the middle distance, at the particular nothing that exists between a man and the horizon, and saying only, "We'll see." His neighbors respected him the way men respect an old oak, quietly from a distance, with a vague awareness that the tree has survived things they haven't. But in the spring of 1983, respect wasn't what Earl Hutchins was getting. Gerald Pruitt was 44 years old, and he wanted you to know it was going very well. He farmed 1,800 acres, or rather, he owned 1,800 acres, which is a different thing, because Gerald Pruitt had not been on a tractor before noon on any day in recent memory. He had a farm manager named Travis who handled what Gerald called the operational side, while Gerald handled what he called the strategic side, which mostly meant attending every meeting of every agricultural organization in the county and speaking at length about conditions in the market. Gerald had built his operation through the 1970s boom on borrowed money, a lot of borrowed money, but he had also inherited enough from his father-in-law that the debt sat at an angle where it worried him without threatening him, which gave him a quality of dangerous confidence. He drove a 1982 Chevrolet Silverado in two-tone brown and cream, always clean, and he wore a decalb seed corn hat that still had its original shape because it had never spent a real day in the field. He was not a cruel man in the way that villains in stories are sometimes cruel. He was something subtler and more common, a man who had succeeded enough to confuse his luck with his judgment. He had a way of leaning against fence posts at meetings and saying things like, "Well, the way I see it," and then pausing to let the room prepare itself for wisdom. He had taken the PIK program immediately, signed up for it in January, pulled 900 acres of his corn ground out of production and collected the government's surplus, sold it at December prices, and by March he had already cleared more money than a bad crop year would have brought him. He was proud of this. He called it, on more than one occasion, playing the game smart. And when word started getting around in early April of 1983 that Earl Hutchins was not taking the PIK money, that old Earl Hutchins, alone on his 300 acres, was planning to plant every single field, Gerald Pruitt was the first one to laugh. The confrontation happened at the Champaign County Farm Bureau monthly meeting on the evening of April 12, 1983, in the basement meeting room of the First United Methodist Church in the town of Rantoul, Illinois, a room that smelled of old carpet and coffee that had been on the burner too long, and the particular wet boot smell of 40 farmers who had come in from a damp spring evening. There were folding chairs in rows, a podium, a chalkboard with commodity prices written across it in someone's careful hand. March corn, $3.12 bushel. March soybeans, $5.71 bushel. The numbers had the tired look of figures that had been disappointing people for a long time. Earl sat in the third row on the aisle. He'd driven over in his pickup, a 1974 Ford F-100 with 187,000 miles on it, and he'd arrived 5 minutes early, which was how he arrived at everything. The meeting was mostly business, PIK enrollment updates, equipment co-op news, a discussion of a drainage tile project on the east side of the county. Then the floor opened up, and Gerald Pruitt, leaning in his chair with one boot up on his knee the way men lean when they are about to perform generosity, said, loud enough for the whole room, "I hear Buck Hutchins over there is gonna plant all 300 acres this spring, corn and beans both, not taking a dime of PIK." The room shifted. 38 men turned to look at Earl Hutchins, who was looking at the chalkboard. "That right, Earl?" someone from the back said, not unkindly, just needing to know if the rumor was true. Earl turned his head slowly. "That's right," he said. Gerald shook his head the way a man shakes his head when he sees a dog walking into traffic. "Earl, I say this with all due respect, that is the dumbest thing I've heard this year, and I've heard some things." That got a laugh, not a mean laugh, more the laugh of men who are scared and relieved to find something outside their fear to smile at. "You're leaving government money on the table," Gerald continued, warming to his audience now. "Free money, grain they're handing you for doing nothing, and you're gonna burn diesel and seed money and fertilizer and pray to God this drought breaks, all on 300 acres that might come in at $4 a bushel if you're lucky." Earl said nothing. "What are you planting?" asked Roy Becker, who farmed the quarter section south of Earl's place and was a fair man who asked questions without malice. All beans, Earl said, 300 acres of soybeans. The room went quieter now, not the quiet of respect, the quiet of a room processing something it considers a mistake. All beans, Gerald repeated slowly as if the words tasted strange. 300 acres, all soybeans in this market in this drought year, you're not putting in any corn at all. That's right. Gerald spread his hands in a gesture that included the whole room. Earl, I know you've been at this a long time. Lord knows I respect that. But friend, this is not 1955. This is 1983 and the market does not care how long you've been farming. Those beans are gonna come in at $5.50, $5.60 a bushel on a good day. You're gonna spend more growing them than you'll make selling them. I'd bet money on it. There was a murmur of agreement around the room. Earl Hutchins looked at Gerald Pruitt for a long moment. Then he looked back at the chalkboard, at the numbers, at $5.71. All right, he said quietly and said nothing more. Gerald leaned over to the man beside him and said, just loud enough, 69 years old and he's finally lost it. Let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you watched a room of reasonable, experienced people agree on something, and one quiet person disagreed, and the quiet person turned out to be right? Because that is a rarer thing than it should be. And it almost always looks from the outside exactly like what happened in that room in Rantoul, Illinois in April of 1983. Stay with me. Because what Earl Hutchins knew, and nobody in that room knew that he knew it, changes everything. To understand what Earl knew, you have to go back, not just to 1983. You have to go back to 1970 and to a conversation Earl had with his father-in-law, a man named Howard Kepner, who had farmed 200 acres in Macon County and who had a habit in his old age of reading the USDA Agricultural Outlook reports the way other men read scripture slowly in good light with a pencil. Howard Kepner used to say, the market is not a thing that happens to you. It's a thing you can read if you're patient enough to study it long enough to understand what it's actually saying. Earl had listened more than anyone knew. For over 30 years, Earl Hutchins had kept a logbook, not a diary. Earl wasn't a diary man, but a logbook, prices, yields, weather, government programs, export numbers, shipping reports from the port of New Orleans. He subscribed to 3 agricultural publications. He had a shortwave radio, and on Tuesday and Thursday evenings he would sit at the kitchen table after supper and listen to commodity reports from Chicago, from Kansas City, from New York, and he would write the numbers in his logbook in a hand so small and regular it looked printed. He had been doing this since 1951. 32 years of numbers, 32 years of patterns. And here is what those patterns had told him in the winter of 1982-83, when he sat at that kitchen table with his logbook open and the shortwave crackling with news from the commodity pits. First, the PIK program was going to pull enormous corn acreage out of production, 30% nationally. In Illinois alone, projections suggested that corn planted acres would drop from 11.4 million in 1982 to somewhere near 7.8 million in 1983. That was a staggering reduction. It would tighten total grain supply. Second, the summer of 1983 was shaping up badly. Earl wasn't a meteorologist, but he was a man who had farmed the same ground for 5 decades and had learned to read the signs the way sailors read weather. The soil moisture heading into spring was low. The La Niña pattern that had pushed the 1982 harvest down, he'd read about it in his farm journal, was not resolving. His gut told him and his logbook confirmed that the summer of 1983 had the makings of a drought year. Third, and this was the piece nobody was talking about at the Farm Bureau, soybean export demand from China and Japan had been rising steadily since 1979. In 1982, China had purchased 3.7 million metric tons of American soybeans. Japan was the single largest buyer in the world. That demand wasn't going away. It was growing, and if American supply tightened because of drought and reduced acreage, the price response in soybeans was going to be significant. Earl had done the math on the back of an envelope in February of 1983. He had written one number in the margin of his logbook, circled it, and stared at it for a long time. $8.50. His projection for where soybeans could go by harvest if the summer played out the way he believed it would. Not guaranteed, not certain, but grounded in 3 decades of watching patterns emerge from the noise of the market the way a face emerges from a crowd. The current price was $5.71. He was looking at a potential gain of nearly $3 a bushel. On 300 acres, at a yield of even 38 bushels per acre, a conservative number for his ground, that was the difference between surviving the farm crisis and thriving in it. He also had one other advantage that nobody in that room in Rantoul had bothered to think about. His 300 acres were paid for. No loan payments, no operating note at the bank. His out-of-pocket cost to plant soybeans with his own equipment and saved seed and careful management of inputs was approximately $98 per acre, $29,400 for the whole farm. He had that money in a savings account at the First National Bank of Rantoul, where it had been earning interest for 2 years untouched. If he was wrong, if the beans came in at $5.50 and the yield was mediocre, he would break even or take a modest loss. He would survive it. If he was right, he would do something that almost no farmer in Champaign County was going to do in 1983. He would have a genuinely good year. He went to work in the first week of May. Now here's what I want you to notice. Earl Hutchkins didn't have a computer. He didn't have a financial advisor or a commodity broker on speed dial. What he had was 32 years of careful attention written down in a logbook in his kitchen. And that right there's a kind of knowledge that money cannot buy and school cannot teach. It has to be lived. Keep watching, because the summer of 1983 was about to test everything he had ever learned. The moment. Let me tell you about planting day. May 9th, 1983. A Monday. The soil temperature at the 4-inch depth on Earl's North Fields was 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees above the minimum for soybean germination, which Earl had checked with the same soil thermometer he had owned since 1958, a glass tube instrument with a wooden handle that he kept in his jacket pocket like a doctor keeps a pen. He was in the field at 5:47 in the morning, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, before the dew had burned off the fence lines. The sky was the color of pewter, and the air smelled of turned earth and the faint diesel exhaust of a tractor warming up, a smell that Earl Hutchkins had associated with the beginning of everything good for as long as he could remember. The machine he was pulling was a John Deere 7000 Max-Emerge planter, 6-row, a 1977 model that he had bought used in 1979 and spent 2 winters rebuilding. He had replaced every seed disc, every finger pickup, every rubber seed tube. He had calibrated it at the kitchen table, counting seeds into a coffee can, adjusting the plates until the population was exactly 165,000 seeds per acre, the number he had arrived at after studying university extension research on soybean populations for his soil type and row spacing. The planter was not glamorous, it was not new, but it was right, every bolt torqued to spec, every bearing greased, every depth wheel adjusted to plant at exactly 1.5 inches, deep enough to find moisture, shallow enough to emerge fast in a potentially dry year. He planted alone, 12-hour days, 7 days straight. Row after row, the 40-10 rumbling through the black soil, the planter laying seed with a precision that the machine had not been born with but had acquired through Earl's patient attention. His daughter came out on the second Saturday with a casserole and stood at the edge of the field watching her father make his passes, and said later that she had felt, watching him, like she was watching something ancient and right. By May 19th, all 300 acres were planted. Then the summer came. The summer of 1983 was the driest summer in Champaign County since 1956. It came not all at once, but the way droughts always come incrementally, each week a little drier than the last, each rain event a little lighter than what was needed, each morning the soil cracking just a little more at the surface. By July 4th, the county extension office was calling it a significant drought. By July 20th, it was historic. Across the county, the fields that had been planted showed their stress. Corn, where anyone had planted it, was rolling its leaves by noon, a sign of moisture deprivation so severe the plant curls in on itself to slow evaporation. The PIK acres, of course, showed nothing, bare brown ground already seeding the season. Gerald Pruitt's planted fields, the 900 acres he had not put into PIK, were struggling. His corn was behind. His farm manager Travis was on the phone with him twice a week saying words like dicey and we'll have to see. But Earl Hutchins' soybeans were doing something remarkable. They were surviving. Partly this was the variety he had chosen, Williams 82, a drought-tolerant cultivar released by the University of Illinois in 1981, that Earl had read about in a seed research bulletin, and had quietly ordered 300 units of at his own expense in January. Partly it was the planting depth, that carefully calibrated 1.5 inches had put the seed right at the moisture line, and the plants had established root systems deep enough to chase water down into the subsoil. Partly it was the population, 165,000 plants per acre, a number that maximized canopy cover early, shading the soil surface and slowing evaporation around the root zone. But partly, and Earl would have been the first to say this if anyone had thought to ask him, it was luck. The good, honest, non-glamorous luck of a man who has spent his life putting himself in the position where luck, when it comes, can actually find him. On the morning of August 14, 1983, Earl drove the perimeter of his fields in his pickup slowly, windows down, and what he saw made him get out of the truck and stand in the road for a while. His soybeans were podding, heavy. The plants were 18 inches tall, dark green in a county that was mostly yellow and brown, with pods setting on every node, a crop that was going to yield. Maybe not a banner year, but a real year, a genuine harvest. At the grain elevator in Rantoul that same week, November soybean futures closed at $8.23 a bushel. Earl drove home and opened his logbook to the page from February, to the number he had circled. $8.50. He was close. Let me pause here and ask you something real. How many times in your life has someone told you that you were wrong confidently, publicly in front of other people, and you knew deep in your gut that you were right? And how did you handle that? Because what Earl Hutchins did next, just kept working, kept his head down, kept trusting what he knew is the hardest thing a person can do. And the most important, don't go anywhere. The silence. Harvest began on October 1st, 1983, on a morning that was cold and cloudless, with a frost from the night before still silvering the stubble and the fence rows. Earl ran a 1972 John Deere 6600 combine, a machine so old it had become invisible to people in the county, the way familiar things become invisible, with a 13-foot grain header and a bin that held 115 bushels. He started on the south field, the heaviest field, the one that ran along County Road 2000 East. The combine nosed into the rows and the soybeans came off the header in a rush, the reel turning, the cutter bar taking everything evenly, and the cab filling with the smell of dry beans and chaff dust and the particular sweetness of a crop that has made it to maturity. By mid-morning, he had made 8 passes. By the time the first pickup truck stopped at the road's edge, he had unloaded the bin twice into the grain wagon parked at the field's corner, 230 bushels in 2 loads in less than 4 hours. He did not stop to calculate, he just kept going. But others stopped. Roy Becker came first, then Lyle Hartman, then the Distur brothers from the next township. They came because word travels fast in flat country where there is nothing to block your view of your neighbor's field. They came and they stood at the fence and they watched the old green combine making its way through soybeans that were throwing off grain the way a healthy crop does, heavy, consistent, load after load after load. Someone called Gerald Pruitt. Gerald arrived at 11:15, pulling up in the two-tone Silverado, stepping out with his dekalb hat on and his hands in his jacket pockets. He stood at the road's edge with the other men and watched for a long time without saying anything. Roy Becker finally said, "I heard he's averaging close to 43 bushels." Nobody spoke. 43 bushels per acre times 300 acres was 12,900 bushels. At the cash price that morning, $8.47 a bushel, with November futures at $8.61, that was a gross of $109,263 before expenses. After his $29,400 in planting costs, after harvest fuel and bin rental and trucking, Earl Hutchins was going to net somewhere in the neighborhood of $68,000 to $72,000 from a 300-acre farm in the worst agricultural year in a generation. The men at the fence understood all of this arithmetic instinctively, the way farmers do, without needing to say it out loud. Gerald Pruitt stood there with his hands in his pockets and watched the old combine make another pass. He watched the grain wagon fill. He watched Earl Hutchins do something on a smaller farm, alone, without a farm manager or a broker or a county extension agent holding his hand, that almost no farmer in Champaign County was going to do in 1983. He watched him win. Nobody laughed, nobody said anything at all. After a while, Gerald Pruitt got back in his truck and drove away. The aftermath. Let me tell you what happened in the years that followed, because the harvest of 1983 was only the beginning of the story. Earl Hutchins took his harvest money, $71,400 net after all expenses, the best single-year return he had seen in 2 decades, and he did 2 things with it. The first thing he did was fix the north drainage on his best 80 acres, a tall project he had been wanting to do for 15 years but had never had the capital for. He hired a contractor named Ben Stutzman, a Mennonite man from Arthur, Illinois, who ran a drainage tile crew and who put in 2,800 feet of 4-inch corrugated drainage tile in October and November of 1983, at a total cost of $8,400. That drainage improvement would increase the yield potential of those 80 acres by an estimated 8 to 12% for the next 40 years. The second thing Earl did was buy out the small mortgage that his neighbor, a man named Carl Wengert, was about to lose to Champaign National Bank. Carl Wengert was 61 years old and had 120 acres that bordered Earl's east side, and Carl had borrowed to expand in 1978 and now owed $47,000 that he could not pay. Earl went to Carl's kitchen table in November of 1983 and offered to buy the 120 acres at the bank's loan value, $47,000, and lease it back to Carl for $60 an acre per year, for as long as Carl wanted to farm it, which was what Carl did for the next 11 years until he retired in 1994. So in the worst year of the farm crisis, Earl Hutchins not only survived, he expanded. He went from 300 acres to 420 acres, increased his drainage, and kept a neighbor on his land instead of watching it go to an absentee investor. That is not a small thing. In the story of rural America in the 1980s, it is, in its quiet way, an extraordinary thing. Gerald Pruitt did not lose his farm. I want to be honest about that. He was too leveraged to have been brought down by one season, and the PIK program had actually helped him more than it hurt him. But in the subsequent years, as the farm crisis deepened and land prices fell, his operation contracted. He sold 600 acres in 1987 at prices far below what he had paid. He sold the Silverado. By 1990, Travis the farm manager was gone and Gerald was farming himself again, which is the thing he should have been doing all along. Earl and Gerald were neighbors for the rest of Earl's life. They were not close, but they were civil in the manner of men who have measured each other and arrived at a quiet understanding. Once, at a farm bureau meeting sometime around 1987, Gerald said to Earl without quite meeting his eyes, "You called it right in '83. Earl said, "I got lucky." Gerald shook his head, "No, you didn't." And Earl said nothing, which was his way of agreeing. Earl Hutchins farmed his 300 acres, 420 acres after 1983, until he was 81 years old in 1995 when his knees finally told him what his mind had been too stubborn to admit, that the body has its own calendar and it cannot be bargained with. He leased the land to Roy Becker's son, Kevin, and moved into a small house in Rantoul. He kept the logbook going until 2001, when his eyesight made writing difficult. By then, the book had 52 years of entries in it. He passed away on March 4, 2006, at the age of 91. His daughter gave the logbook to the University of Illinois Agricultural Library, where it remains in the Special Collections Archive. A researcher who studied it in 2009 said in a journal article that it was one of the most complete records of farm-level commodity market observation she had encountered from the post-war era. His 300 acres are still being farmed today. The drainage tile he put in November of 1983 with the money from those soybeans is still doing its work in the ground. Before I close, I want you to think about something. Earl Hutchins did not win because he was smarter than everyone in that room in Rantoul. He won because he had been paying attention longer than everyone in that room. And he had the courage, quietly, without drama, to trust what 32 years of attention had taught him, even when a room full of people were telling him he was wrong. There's a lesson in that goes well beyond farming. I think you know what it is. The morals. There's an old saying that farmers used to pass down before the world got so loud that old sayings became embarrassing. The land will always tell you the truth. It's the people around it you have to watch out for. Earl Hutchins understood that saying not as a criticism of people but as a discipline. A reminder to look at what is actually there rather than what the room agrees to see. The commodity price on a chalkboard, the soil moisture in his fingers, the pattern of 32 years of numbers in a logbook. These were the things that would not lie to him. The crowd in that church basement in Rantoul was not wrong to be scared. The farm crisis was real. The fear was legitimate. The PIK program was, for many farmers, a genuine lifeline. Gerald Pruitt was not a bad man. He was a man making reasonable decisions based on the information he was willing to carry. His mistake was not greed or arrogance, or not only those things. His mistake was that he had stopped learning. He had mistaken his recent successes for permanent knowledge and stopped asking the questions that had made him successful in the first place. Earl Hutchins had never stopped asking questions. He had asked them alone at his kitchen table in the quiet after supper when the shortwave crackled in from Chicago. He had written the answers in a logbook that nobody else had any reason to care about. He had done this not because he expected a reward, but because it was the honest way to farm, the patient way, the way his father-in-law Howard Kepner had taught him to look at the world. Patience is not passive. That is what people misunderstand about it. Patience is 32 years of showing up at the same kitchen table and writing the same kind of numbers into the same kind of book. Patience is walking your fields every morning and learning to read what they're telling you. Patience is the willingness to hold a position, financial, intellectual, moral, through the discomfort of being publicly doubted, because you have done the work to earn the confidence you're standing on. Old wisdom does not expire. That is the thing that Earl Hutchins' story insists upon. In a world that is constantly offering you newer models and faster answers and louder voices telling you which way to run, old wisdom, accumulated slowly and honestly, is still the most reliable thing there is. The 1977 planter calibrated to 1.5 inches, the logbook from 1951, the soil thermometer in the jacket pocket, these things were not romantic relics. They were precision instruments, honed by decades of use in the hands of a man who knew exactly what he was doing with them. Do not judge the old way by how it looks. Judge it by what it produces. Earl Hutchins planted 300 acres of soybeans in the drought year of 1983, alone on paid-for ground, while the room laughed. The room stopped laughing on October 3, 1983, standing at the fence on County Road 2000 East in Champaign County, Illinois, watching a 69-year-old man on an old green tractor smile his way through the best harvest in the county. That smile was not arrogance, it was not vindication. It was just a man who had done the work, trusting the work, and finding once again that the work was enough. If this story meant something to you, if you've seen that kind of patient, private knowledge in someone you knew, or if you've been that person yourself, dismissed and doubted and quietly right, leave a comment below. Tell me about it, because the forgotten farmer is not always someone from 60 years ago. Sometimes they're standing right next to you. I'm your narrator, this is The Forgotten Farmer. We'll see you next time.